A $40 billion criminal empire is operating with near total impunity right on the seams of Southeast Asia. This is the reality of Myanmar's border scam centers, a humanitarian and financial crisis that regional leaders have completely failed to stop. The architecture protecting them is far more resilient than any single raid. Sovereign borders are being weaponized by syndicates while neighbors stand by. So how did this network grow so powerful? And why is no one putting an end to it? The trail begins with a series of empty performances staged for external consumption. Act 1. The show for Beijing, the silence in the room. We open with a deep institutional silence. Across the region, the official response to human trafficking has been long on promises but remarkably short on true accountability. What we are about to see is the beginning of a compliance dance where regimes pretend to act only when the pressure becomes unbearable. That theater played out in real time last year on the banks of the Moi River. On a cold November morning in 2025, Myanmar's military junta staged a high-profile raid on the notorious border compounds of Shwekoko. State television broadcast soldiers marching past high concrete walls, seized Starlink internet terminals piled on tables, and machinery tearing down buildings. A junta spokesman confidently declared that the cyber scam centers had been eradicated from their roots. It was an impressive demonstration of power, designed to look like a final victory. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the truth on the ground began to surface. Satellite imagery and local reporting by the Democratic Voice of Burma later confirmed that out of 77 buildings marked for demolition in Shwekoko, only 3 were actually razed. The rest were simply sealed for the cameras. By February 2026, just 2 months after the military regime declared total victory, operations had fully resumed. The scammers never left the area. They simply dispersed into hotels, guest houses, and residential homes across the town. The infrastructure was untouched. To complete the cosmetic cleanup, the current border guard force, the powerful local militia running the territory, officially rebranded itself as the Karen National Army on January 1st, 2026. There were new names on the documents and new insignias on the uniforms, but the exact same commanders were running the exact same compounds. The entire apparatus remained perfectly intact, protected by an illusion of political change designed to appease outside observers. The entire show was performed for an audience of one, which is Beijing. In January 2025, the trafficking of a well-known Chinese actor named Wang Xing to a compound on the border triggered an unprecedented public outcry on Chinese social media. China's Assistant Minister for Public Security flew personally to Thailand, forcing Bangkok to cut off utilities to 5 border areas within weeks, while SpaceX disabled 2,500 illegal Starlink units. Yet the compound simply switched to diesel generators, proving their local resilience. Act 2. The waterline where jurisdiction ends. So how did a narrow strip of frontier land become a global center for industrial-scale human trafficking and cyber fraud? The syndicates did not build this empire by accident. They mapped the legal cracks of the region with precision. To understand how, we need to look at the waterline where national sovereignty fractures and domestic law loses all its teeth. Shwekoko sits 16 kilometers north of the Thai border town of Madzot, separated only by the narrow waters of the Moi River. Jurisdiction ends precisely at that waterline. This geographic fracture has been exploited since the 1990s, starting with loosely regulated casinos built to attract foreign tourists. The infrastructure had always existed. What changed over the decades was the product, the technology, and the terrifying global scale of the operation. The true pivot came in 2017, when Yatai International Holdings Group registered Shwekoko as a massive new city project, using the respectable language of tourism and real estate to hide the construction of guarded tech compounds. Then, when the 2021 military coup plunged Myanmar into civil war, it created a security vacuum. Ethnic armed organizations consolidated their autonomy and turned online fraud into the premier growth industry of the pandemic era, using development projects as cover. The criminal networks realized that the existing special economic zone architecture could provide perfect regulatory cover. On paper, these developments are legitimate foreign investments driving regional growth. In practice, they are fortified criminal cities operating entirely outside the reach of domestic law enforcement. They own security, they own power grids, total immunity generated by the chaos of the civil war across the river. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime estimated in May 2025 that cyber scams in the Mekong region generate revenue equivalent to 40% of the combined formal gross domestic product of Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. That is not a regional sideline. That is a parallel economy. And according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, what began as a localized border phenomenon has now globalized. with new hub nodes stretching as far away as Eastern Europe and South America. Act 3. The indispensable paradox of $40 billion. Follow the money, and the mystery of Shwekoko disappears completely. The dark paradox of this industry is that its annual revenue is approaching $40 billion, a river of cash that corrupts everything it touches. When an illicit industry grows larger than the formal economies of entire nations, the political will to dismantle it vanishes behind closed doors. The principal architect of this zone is Saw Chitphil, the leader of the Karen National Army, who profits directly by trafficking thousands of people and selling them high-priced utilities and armed protection. Though the United States Treasury extended sanctions to his sons in May 2025, he remains fully operational. Myanmar's military regime profits too, routinely using these syndicates as bargaining chips to manage its own survival in the civil war. This leaves China in a deeply contradictory position. It is simultaneously the primary victim and the indispensable regulator of the crisis. Chinese criminal syndicates operate the vast majority of the compounds, and Chinese citizens are heavily targeted by these frauds. Yet Beijing uses its unique ability to disrupt these networks as geopolitical leverage, extending its security footprint across mainland Southeast Asia through the Langkang Mekong Law Enforcement Cooperation Center. A crime crisis turned into a diplomatic tool. When neighboring states try to intervene, they collide with a wall of political and financial complicity. Thailand's infrastructure and border trade are deeply intertwined with these frontier economies. Bangkok cut off cross-border utilities only after intense, direct pressure from Chinese ministers, not on its own initiative. A major anti-scam push announced by the Thai Prime Minister in June 2025 was derailed almost instantly when the Prime Minister was suspended from office. The urban graphic highlights the sophisticated financial networks backing the border zones. The plumbing of the industry flows through major platforms like the Huione Group, a Cambodian conglomerate that has become the primary financial conduit for scam operations. The group processed over $100 billion in Tether transactions between January 2024 and June 2025, despite the United States Financial Crimes Enforcement Network designating it a major money laundering concern. Operations continued, shielded by directors who are close relatives of the Cambodian Prime Minister. Act 4. The loop between the victim and the screen. At the bottom of this financial pyramid sits a human meat grinder. Here is where the screens of internet users on the other side of the world connect directly to the physical torment of captive laborers. To understand why this empire survives, we have to look past the financial data and into the human cost that fuels it every single day. The United States Institute of Peace estimates that over 300,000 people are currently held in forced labor conditions across compounds in the region. According to United Nations human rights data, at least 120,000 of them are trapped inside Myanmar alone. These are not willing participants. They are captives from at least 66 different countries, lured by fake online advertisements promising high-paying corporate roles in customer service, digital marketing, or technology. Take Pong, a young Thai worker drowning in debt to a local loan shark. He responded to what looked like a legitimate corporate job posting in Bangkok. Instead, he was driven across the border and delivered to the Yulong Bay Park compound in Mayawadi. He was forced to work 15 to 17 hours a day under the constant threat of physical violence, scamming internet users thousands of miles away. This creates a tragic victim-perpetrator paradox that frustrates international law enforcement. These workers are forced to actively commit cyber fraud to avoid being beaten or sold to another compound. Are they criminals to be prosecuted or trafficking victims to be rescued? That ambiguity slows down international repatriation, stalls cross-border investigations, and keeps the compounds running without real interference. While individuals like Pong suffer on the ground, the financial damage cascades across the globe. American citizens lost $10 billion to these networks in a single year. Indian citizens lost $2.57 billion in 2024 alone, a 206% increase from the year before. Over half of those global losses traced directly back to digital infrastructure operating out of Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Act 5. The $40 billion blind spot. The persistence of Myanmar's scam empire exposes the structural limits built directly into the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. An illicit industry generating $40 billion annually has unleashed financial contagion touching every single member state. And yet the official response from regional leaders has been hollow, leaving a massive security blind spot at the heart of mainland Southeast Asia. On one side, an active humanitarian emergency involving hundreds of thousands of forced laborers. On the other, the official institutional response consists almost entirely of a non-binding regional cooperation roadmap, a string of high-level declarations, and endless expert group meetings in Bali. The diplomatic output is completely disconnected from the criminal reality on the ground, and the syndicates are free to expand without facing any coordinated regional resistance. The regional principle of non-interference, the rule that prevents the bloc from intervening in any member state's internal affairs, is the very core of the paralysis. The exact same diplomatic rule that historically prevented a collective resolution to territorial disputes or civil conflict ensures that the bloc cannot build any real enforcement architecture to dismantle Shwekoko. The founding logic of regional diplomacy has become the ultimate shield for organized crime. The criminal networks did not have to break the regional order to survive. They simply located the exact seams where national jurisdictions end and built a multi-billion-dollar business inside the gaps. Each country acts unilaterally, committing real political will only when its own citizens become highly visible victims, as with the signing of the United Nations Convention Against Cybercrime in Hanoi in October 2025. Uncoordinated action just lets the scammers move between jurisdictions. This institutional vacuum has transformed Beijing into the primary regulator of mainland Southeast Asia. China now sets the enforcement agenda that regional leaders should have led. The only enforcement actions that have caused genuine disruption came from direct, bilateral muscle out of Beijing through joint operations that cleared over 70,000 arrests by late 2024 and by forcing utility cuts on the ground. China holds the actual keys to enforcement. That regional inaction comes with a long-term price. Beijing is openly using the cyber scam crisis as a pretext to expand its permanent police and security footprint deep into the sovereign territories of its southern neighbors. When a regional institution chooses to remain a bystander to an active crisis on its own borders, it inevitably yields the steering wheel to the superpower willing to clear the road. The true danger of Shwekoko is not that the system is broken. It is that it is working exactly as designed for those who profit from the gaps. When sovereignty is used as a shield for crime, and diplomacy becomes an excuse for inaction, the borders of Southeast Asia cease to be lines of defense. They become the foundation of an empire. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.